Chapter 1. The feather that should not be at 6:45 on a raw March evening, when Fritz was preparing dinner and Nero Wolfe was preparing to resent the world, the doorbell rang. In the old brownstone, on West 35th Street, that was enough to qualify as an offense. I opened the door and found a narrow man in a dark overcoat, with ink in the seams of his fingers and worry in his eyes. "Mr. Goodwin, my name is Ezra Pell. I must see Nero Wolfe at once." People often say that. Few of them mean it in a way worth hearing. Pell did. I brought him in. Wolfe was behind his desk in the office, massive, still, and already annoyed. He gave Pell one glance. "Sit down. State your business briefly." Pell sat on the edge of the red leather chair as if he distrusted comfort. "I own Barrow & Keane, fine printing on East 21st Street. I print limited editions, family memorials, private speeches, confidential documents. 3 months ago, after finishing an expensive private order, I found a blue feather in my typecase." Wolfe's lids lowered, "and that compels my attention. It happened again, and again 5 times in all. Always after secret jobs, never after ordinary work. That interested me more than it did Wolfe, though he never misses much when pretending to miss everything." "A feather," I said. "As in bird. Yes, blue, always in the uppercase used for the title page. Do you have one?" Pell produced a small cardboard box and opened it. Inside, on black velvet, lay a vivid blue feather, narrow and glossy. It was handsome enough, and it gave me a small, cold feeling. Wolfe inspected it without pleasure. "You suspect a joke." Number after each feather. Something private became public. A line from a memorial volume reached a columnist. Figures from a confidential speech reached a rival. A passage from a wedding book turned up in gossip. Each time, a secret job. Each time, a feather. "So your meaning is," Wolfe said, "that someone is marking documents that will later be betrayed?" "Yes." "Then why did you not come sooner?" "Because now there is another job. Finished today. The most dangerous yet." That got Wolfe's full attention. "What job?" Pell swallowed. 50 copies of an unsigned confession. It names names, gives dates. Accuses the writer of ruining a man years ago by falsifying records. It is to be delivered tonight, through a locker at Grand Central," I said. "And you expect another feather?" "Yes, before or after, I don't know. But it will come, and if it does, I am afraid what follows will be worse than gossip." Wolfe leaned back, fingertips together. "Who had access to this material?" "My compositor, Leon Kremp. Under my eye, my pressman, Joseph Biener, my niece, Martha Pell, who handles correspondence, and myself. No one else." "You trust them?" "I trust my niece. The others, I trust as far as business requires, but I cannot believe any of them capable of this repeated malice." I could. Repeated malice is one of New York's busiest trades. Wolfe grunted. "Your client." "I know only the name he gave, Adrian Dace. Whether it is real, I cannot say." "And you accepted cash for an anonymous confession?" "I am a printer, Mr. Wolfe. Men bring words. I print them." Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment. That meant thought, not sleep. Finally, he opened them and turned to me. "Archie, you will go with Mr. Pell to his shop, examine the premises. Observe the persons involved if possible. If the confession is still to be delivered, accompany him." Pell exhaled. The first sign he had hoped for help, and not merely paid for it. "Then you will take the case." "I have not taken it. I have consented to look at it. $10,000. Pell paid without argument. That told me either he was rich, desperate, or too frightened to haggle. Possibly all three. After a quick dinner, I rode downtown with him through a dirty wind, sharpened New York night. Barrow & Keane, fine printing, occupied the ground floor of a narrow building. Inside, the shop smelled of ink, oil, and paper. Cases of type stood against the wall. A press crouched at the rear. The office was enclosed in frosted glass. There I met Martha Pell, Ezra Pell's niece and office manager. She was about 30, composed, direct, and plainly tired of feathers and detectives. "You will find no ghosts here, Mr. Goodwin," she said. "I'm seldom lucky on my first call." I looked over the shop. Doors locked. Windows fastened. No sign of intrusion. If someone was getting at Pell's private jobs, it had to be by access, not magic. When I returned to the office, Pell was standing by the safe. Martha was at the desk. The room was quiet enough for us to hear the front bell at once. I opened the door. A man in a dark coat stood there, hat low. "For Mr. Pell," he said, and thrust an envelope at me. "Your name?" "None." He turned and was gone before I reached the sidewalk. Inside, Pell tore open the envelope. A typed slip fell into his hand. He read it, then passed it to me. It said, "Do not deliver the confession." That was all. No signature, but something else slid from the envelope onto the desk. A blue feather. Chapter 2. Ink, lead, and a dead candidate. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was past midnight, and Nero Wolfe had retired to his room with the air of a monarch withdrawing from a disappointing court. I left a note on his desk, kept the blue feather in its box, and went to bed with the comfortable expectation that morning would improve nothing. It did not. At 8:30 the telephone rang while I was at breakfast with coffee, eggs, and a disposition made brittle by lack of sleep. The voice was Inspector Kramer's, hard and blunt enough to chip enamel. "Where's Wolfe?" "In the plant room till 11. "Why?" "Because a man is dead and your name is lying around near him. That will wake a man better than coffee." "Whose name?" "Yours. Get downtown, East 22nd Street, behind a garage, and don't start being bright before I see you." He hung up, proving again that police manners are designed less for communication than for blood pressure. The alley was narrow, dirty and mean, with brick walls sweating dampness, and a garbage can tilted like a drunk. A campaign volunteer named Walter Hess lay on the pavement near the rear service door of a closed lunchroom. He was on his side, one arm crooked under him, hat gone, overcoat open. There was blood dried dark at the back of his head. He had the kind of face that looks earnest even after death, which can be an advantage in politics and a disadvantage in alleys. I knew him only slightly by sight. Walter Hess was one of Harold Vane's campaign workers, a young reform enthusiast with a straight nose, an earnest face, and the annoying habit of looking as if decency ought to be enough. Near his body, flattened against the wall by damp, was one of my cards. "Archie Goodwin, Nero Wolfe, investigation." Kramer saw me looking at it. "You want to tell me why your calling card is taking the air with a corpse?" "Not especially, but I can. I was at Pell Private Press last night. If Vane had business with Pell, that might explain it better than murder by stationery." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "You know Pell?" "I know him since yesterday afternoon." He grunted. "Then save us time. Around 4 this morning a patrolman found Vane here. Head bashed in, no wallet. But that may mean mugging or may mean nothing. Also, Pell reports that a full run of campaign circulars for Vane disappeared from his shop overnight. 5,000 copies, and Pell says you were there." "I was. The circulars were not missing when I left." "Then maybe you took them for exercise." I ignored that. "What kind of circulars?" Kramer took one from his pocket and handed it over. Cheap cream stock, bold black type, 2-color heading, Harold Vane for clean city government. Below that, a photograph and several paragraphs of promises about contracts, transit, and municipal books that would be open to daylight for the first time since Babylon. I turned it over. "No printer's imprint." "That's odd," I said. "What is?" "A reform candidate, printing anonymous circulars. Pell says Vane wanted discretion until formal release this afternoon." "Did Pell say when they were printed?" "Yesterday and last night." That clicked against what Ezra Pell had told me about the confession job. Private printing cash client, secrecy. Then another private job in the same shop, tied to a man now dead. I looked again at the alley. "Any witnesses?" One woman heard a shout around 1:30. "A driver says he saw 2 men near the corner at about 1:15. No help, we'll get more." Kramer jerked a thumb at the card. You and Wolfe had better have a reason for sniffing around Pell. We do, but Wolfe will decide how fragrant it is. His jaw set. Don't play with me, Goodwin. A campaign man gets his skull cracked, and a print run disappears the same night. I want motives, enemies, and what hit him. And Wolfe, I said, will want paper, ink, and timing. That annoyed him, which improved my morning a little. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had descended and was at his desk with beer and correspondence. I told him everything from the alley to the vanished circulars. He shut his eyes. Foo, a candidate. Politics is organized discourtesy. Dead discourtesy in this case. He ignored that. The circulars were printed at Keene's shop. The confession had first led us into the same line of work. The feather appeared there too. Now one of Vane's men is dead, and the circulars are stolen. Also, Kramer is tender about my business card. How did it get there? I may have dropped it at Pell's, or someone may have borrowed one from the stack in the hall. I dislike both choices. Wolfe nodded. As do I. The theft of the circulars is instructive. How? A man steals 5,000 campaign circulars only if he fears their use, needs the paper as proof, or wishes to hide evidence of composition and schedule. Printed matter has a clock in it. Archie. Paper ordered. Type set. Forms locked. Press run completed. Sheets drying. Bundles tied. Murder also has a clock. We must see whether the hands coincide. I said, that is one of your better breakfast remarks. The bell rang. Fritz admitted Ezra Pell, who looked as though the night had taken bites out of him. He sat without being asked. Mr. Wolfe, I have just come from the police. They questioned me for an hour. They may come back and arrest me. Possibly, Wolfe said. Did they find a feather? Pell stared. Number. Then sit still and answer questions. When did Harold Vane come to you? 3 days ago. He wanted circulars and window cards printed quickly and quietly. He said open announcement would come later. Why quietly? He did not say. He paid half in advance. Did he come alone? Yes. Did he know of the confession job? Absolutely not. Wolfe's eyes opened wider. You are certain? Yes. Certainty is expensive. Spend it carefully. Who besides you knew the circulars were in the shop overnight? My niece Martha, Kremp, Bina. No one else. Did Vane come to the shop last night? Pell hesitated. That was enough to make me lean forward. Yes, he said, briefly. At about 10:30, he was agitated. He asked whether any extra copies of the circular had been made, whether any proofs remained, whether anyone had inquired about them. I said no. He left at once. Why? Wolfe asked softly. Did you omit that from your account to Archie? Pell's face colored, because I thought it concerned only the circulars, not the feather business. Wolfe's lips tightened. Again you edit facts. It is a repulsive habit, I said. Did he say what had him scared? Number only that if anyone asked, I was to say nothing of his visit. That settled it for me. Someone in Harold Vane's organization had been afraid before he got dead, and afraid of something connected with Pell's press, the blue feather, the confession, the stolen circulars, the alley. They were starting to look like parts of one sentence, merely written in different alphabets. Wolfe turned to me. Go back, see Miss Pell and the employees. Learn the exact schedule of the circular printing, the confession printing, and Vane's visit. Also discover whether Vane had enemies worth the trouble of a dark alley. Everyone says reformers do. I prefer names. As I got up, he added, and Archie, retrieve your card from the police if possible. I dislike having our names scattered over corpses. That, I told him, is a principle any gentleman can endorse. Chapter 3. The costume house clue by 11 o'clock that morning. On the Keene matter, I had learned 3 things, and none of them made me cheerful. First, a blue feather can travel through New York with more privacy than a congressman. Second, if you ask enough milliners whether they have recently sold one vivid blue plume, They begin to look at you as if you have a private arrangement with Bellevue. Third, when Nero Wolfe tells you from behind his desk that a feather is not decoration but evidence, he is usually right in a way that makes you wish he had been wrong. I had started with the simple route, bird shops, if you can call them that. Places that sold mounted ducks, stuffed owls, and peacock tails to people with too much wall space. Then millinery counters. Then a taxidermist on 3rd Avenue who looked at the feather through half spectacles and said it had once belonged either to a bird or a liar. Since that covered a lot of territory, I left him to his philosophy. The feather in question had been found in the back room of Barrow and Keane, fine printing, where Emil Keane had died 2 nights before, with his skull cracked by a composing stick. It matched the earlier feathers Ezra Pell had reported. It was a ridiculous thing to be lying under a stone paper cutter, amid ink rollers and ledgers. A narrow plume dyed so bright a blue it seemed to sneer at the sober trade of printing. Inspector Kramer had dismissed it as trash tracked in on a customer's hem. Wolfe had taken one glance, pinched it between finger and thumb as if it were contagious, and said, "Pufui, trash does not select its resting place." That was how the second half of the case got ruined for me. The circulars were printed at Keane's shop. The confession had first led us into the same line of work. The feather appeared there too. At 11:15 I was on Riddle Street, which is one of those small Manhattan streets that look as if they had been forgotten by every improvement society since 1890. Half the buildings were brick boxes with dusty windows. The other half were places where things were rented, mended, or regretted. On the corner, a sign in flaking gilt announced Lorimer Costume and Theatrical Supply, established 1908, as if age alone made a papier. Mfefe crown respectable. Inside, the air smelled of face powder, damp velvet, and old glue. Capes hung from rods. Shelves held masks, military jackets, false beards, and helmets that had never been near a battlefield. From somewhere in the rear came the thump of a trunk lid and a female voice saying that Cleopatra would have looked better in green. A little man with a yellow measuring tape around his neck came at me sideways, like a crab with manners. Rentals downstairs, purchases to the left, fittings by appointment. "I only want information," I said. "That is never rented. What is it?" I took the feather from an envelope and let him look. His eyes sharpened at once, which was better than the blank stares I had been collecting all morning. He reached for it. I didn't hand it over. "Recognize it." "I might if I held it. You might if you didn't." He sighed. "You are from a newspaper or the police?" "Neither. Call me a man with a question." He peered again. "Showgirl trim cheap, dyed coke, machine bundled. We sell dozens." "Dozens to whom?" "To people who pay." He took the tape off his neck and folded it with ceremony. "If you want customer names, bring a subpoena or a pistol." I gave him my smile, the medium one that suggests I might have a subpoena in one pocket and a pistol in the other. A man was killed. That helped. Not much, but enough. His name turned out to be Sidney Lorimer, grandson of the founder, proprietor, wardrobe doctor, and guardian of 1,000 second-rate splendors. He led me to a counter in the rear and took out a ledger. It was as thick as one of Wolfe's unabridged dictionaries and looked equally optimistic. "This trim," he said, tapping the feather with one stained finger, "came from a lot received 6 weeks ago. Blue for revue headdresses, carnival masks, dance capes, that sort of trash. We sold some to the Midas Roof Show, some to a costume class downtown, and some retail." "Retail to whom?" He licked his thumb and turned pages. "A Miss Della Vane, 3 bundles. A Mr. Jonas Pyle, 1 bundle, with silver braid and black domino masks. Cash, no address." Then another sale to, he squinted, "Mrs. Emil Keane." That got my attention. "You're sure?" He pushed the ledger around. There it was in a crabbed hand. 4 days before Keane died. Mrs. Emil Keane, 1 yard blue feather trim, 1 half mask, black satin, 1 stage cape, lined. Did she come in person? She did. A neat woman, nervous hands, too much control in the face. She said it was for a surprise entertainment. Did you believe her? My business is costume, not belief. I copied the entry into my notebook and asked him to describe her. He did a fair job. Dark hat, grey suit, voice clipped as if words cost her extra. Then I asked about Jonas Pyle. Lorimer shrugged. Tall fellow, brown overcoat. He knew what he wanted and didn't chat, paid cash. Age, 40 or 50. Men are harder than women. Women insist on being noticed. That was Sidney Lorimer. I thanked him and started for the door. He called after me. If the murdered man is the one from Barrow and Keene, tell your police friend he is looking at the feather wrong. I turned how? It was not lost from a hat. This one was torn from trim, already stitched onto cloth. See the base thread. Trace. He rubbed finger and thumb together. Somebody pulled it loose. Outside, I stood on Riddle Street with taxis, honking at the avenue, and a pushcart man arguing with a grocer about oranges. The feather had turned from accident into property, and from property into message. Someone in Emil Keene's orbit had been using theatre scraps for something that had nothing to do with entertainment. A printer's widow buying a stage cape and mask 4 days before her husband got killed was not a fact to mislay. I used a drugstore booth to phone the house. Fritz answered. Then Archie Goodwin was passed to Nero Wolfe, which is a trick Fritz manages without seeming supernatural. Well, Wolfe demanded. I have acquired culture on Riddle Street. The blue feather is costume trim, not birdstock, millinery, or museum remains. It came from a theatrical supplier. One customer who bought it was Mrs. Emil Keene. There was a silence. That often meant Wolfe was getting fat satisfaction from being right. Details, he said. I gave them to him, including Lorimer's point about the thread trace. Excellent, Wolfe said. I'm glad one of us is happy. Also, a man named Jonas Pyle bought the same trim with black masks and silver braid. Pyle, Wolfe murmured. Yes, that stopped me. Yes, what? Mr. Keene's partner mentioned yesterday that Pyle was a broker who handled Barrow and Keene's paper contracts. He neglected to mention an acquaintance with theatrical debris, return at once. Will lunch wait? For you, no. For me, yes, drive carefully. That last was an insult. Wolfe considered everyone's driving a form of moral collapse. When I got back to West 35th Street, lunch had not waited for me, but my share had. Fritz, who had the soul of an artist and the discipline of an executioner, produced cold sliced duck, potato salad, and coffee. I gave it the attention it deserved, then went to the office. Wolfe was behind his desk with his eyes half closed, which in another man might have meant repose. In Wolfe it meant that 60 billion cells were conducting a private election. Saul Panzer was in the red leather chair, looking as if he had been born in it and was charging rent. Archie, Wolfe said. You know Saul. I know him well enough to lose money to him at poker and not complain. Saul inclined his head. The widow Keene was not home. Her maid says she left at 10 and has not returned. Jonas Pyle is at his office on Broad Street, receiving callers and behaving like a taxpayer. I handed Wolfe my notes. He scanned them, grunted, and pushed them aside. The costume purchased does not prove guilt. It proves contrivance. The distinction is important. Everything is important to you except my peace of mind. Your peace of mind is not among my responsibilities, Saul said. What was Keene printing, Archie? A limited-run prospectus for a mining promotion, labels for a liquor importer, and, according to the partner, some private invitations for a supper club benefit. Wolfe opened his eyes. The benefit invitations, who ordered them? Not me, he glared. If you had known, I would not ask. Find out. I got it from the partner by telephone within 10 minutes. The order had been placed by one Miss Della Vane, nightclub singer and occasional hostess, for an event called the Midnight Masque, private distribution, elaborate stock, cash deposit. I hung up and reported. Saul's brows lifted. Wolfe shut his eyes again. A costume merchant, a nightclub singer, a broker, a widow, and a dead printer, I said. This city gives value. Wolfe ignored that. Archie, get Miss Vane here at 4 o'clock. If she declines, Improve your invitation. Sol, continue on Mrs. Keene. Also on Pile, especially on evenings. I want movements, companions, and habits. Sol rose. Okay. When he had gone, I looked at Wolfe. You have a notion? Of course I have a notion. I am not a cabbage. Is it one you can share with the hired help? It is incomplete. The feather is a signal because it is conspicuous and artificial. Such objects are used when the sender assumes the recipient will understand the code, and outsiders will not. Mr. Keene printed things for people who dealt in appearances, nightclubs, benefits, promotions. It follows that his death may have grown not from commerce but from disguise. That is almost pretty. It is merely coherent. I leaned back and crossed my legs. There is still the small matter of why a respectable printer's wife bought a mask and cape. Respectable? Wolfe snorted. My dear Archie, respectability is often only cowardice that has been solvent for a generation. At 4:10, Miss Delavane arrived in a hat that looked as if it had started as architecture and then lost confidence. She was blonde by intention, handsome by effort, and angry by nature. Since that suited my mood, we got on at once. Wolfe bowed from his chair by 1/8 of an inch. Miss Vane, sit, please. She sat and gave me the kind of glance women reserve for men they may need later, but dislike already. Mr. Goodwin said this concerns Emil Keene. I barely knew him. You knew him well enough to employ his firm, Wolfe said. For printing, that is not intimacy. But you ordered invitations for the midnight masque. Her chin lifted. Private entertainment. Where masks were worn. Yes. And blue feather trim was used in the decorations or costumes. A pause tiny. I saw it because I was looking. Some, she said. Wolfe's voice stayed mild. Did Mrs. Emil Keene attend? Did Jonas Pyle? Another pause. I believe so. I don't keep attendance books. Who did? That stung her. What is this? An inquiry into my guest list. No, Wolfe said. An inquiry into murder. She went still then. Not innocent stillness, calculation. She looked at me, then back at Wolfe. Mr. Keene telephoned me the afternoon before he died. He wanted to know whether a second set of invitations had been authorized. That put a new brick in the wall. Second set, Wolfe asked. Yes, same design, same wording, but a different date typed in. He thought it was an error. I told him I had ordered no such thing. Did he say who collected them? He said he would check and call me back. He didn't. Wolfe nodded once. Thank you, Miss Vane. You have been more useful than you intended. She stood. Am I free to go, for the moment? After she left, I turned to Wolfe. Counterfeit, invitations to a masked event, somebody with access to the printer, the masks, and the guest circle. That is neat enough, even for you. Wolfe put a fingertip to the blue feather lying on blotting paper before him. Yes, and now at last we are approaching substance, when truth is dressed as something else. Archie, one must ask not who wore the costume, but who arranged the wardrobe. That sounded like Wolfe, and it sounded like trouble. Since with him the two were twins, I merely got out my notebook and prepared for the next unpleasant development. Chapter 4. The typecase with too many secrets. If there is one thing I have learned from living with Nero Wolfe, it is that he can look at a room for 5 minutes and find in it enough offense to keep his mind busy for a week. He also dislikes leaving the brownstone before necessity, has wrapped a rope around his waist and started pulling. Since necessity had done that very thing, and since I was the rope, we spent the next morning in the back shop of Barrow and Keene, fine printing, among the presses, frames, rollers, and honest smells of ink and oil. It was not a place for Wolfe. The floor was gritty. The light from the high windows was mean. A machine in the far room clanked in a way that would have driven him to arson if he had been forced to hear it daily. He stood in his overcoat and yellow gloves, planted wide, his lips compressed as if the air itself had insulted him. Inspector Kramer was there, scowling at the scene with the proprietary irritation he always showed when Wolfe intruded on police territory and improved it. Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins was with him, large, quiet, and looking as if he had been built out of parts intended for farm machinery. Also present were Ezra Pell, proprietor of the firm and heir to a jaw made for apology, and a thin technician from the police laboratory who had spent the first 10 minutes explaining why the composing stick that had killed Emil Keane was certainly the weapon, since no one disputed it, that had left him dissatisfied. Wolfe had listened to all that with the expression of a man being informed that water is damp. "Mr. Pell," he said now, gazing at a long double bank of wooden typecases. "These are under your charge." Pell swallowed. He had the narrow shoulders and habitual flinch of a man who has spent years standing just outside somebody else's authority. "Yes, that section there, especially hand, set specialty jobs, small runs, custom work, plates, ornaments." Wolfe pointed. "That one." Pell blinked. "That is Keane's case." It was Keane's. Wolfe moved toward it, and Kramer barked, "Don't touch anything you don't have to." Wolfe turned his head enough to let one eye travel over the inspector. "Mr. Kramer, if your men had touched what they had to, I should be at home." That made Kramer redden, which always improved him. I stepped in before he could use language Pearlie would have had to pretend not to hear. "Easy, boys. Let's save the riot until after lunch." Wolfe bent over the typecase. It was a broad, shallow cabinet of many compartments, each holding its own little population of letters, spaces, rules, and odds and ends. If you have never seen a printer's typecase, imagine a city laid flat and alphabetized. Most of the compartments were grey with the faint powder of metal and years. A few, however, showed clean edges and a slight oily gleam. Wolfe saw it at once. He didn't touch. At first, he simply stood there, his head slightly down, eyes moving from box to box. Then he extended one gloved finger and pointed. "These." Pell leaned in. "What about them?" "They have been used recently." "Of course, it is a typecase. Number, this is a repository. Most of these compartments contain pieces untouched for months. Those there, however, are polished by handling, not all, a pattern." Kramer came over, grudgingly interested. "Could mean Keane was using those letters." Wolfe straightened. "Could, did you inventory them?" Kramer said nothing. Pearlie looked at the floor. Wolfe made a sound deep in his throat. "Archie," that meant get to work. I borrowed a composing gauge and began lifting pieces carefully from the compartments Wolfe indicated, while Pearlie found evidence envelopes and lab tags. Pell hovered, sweating. The police technician objected once, got one look from Kramer, and retired into silence. It took 15 minutes to establish that Wolfe had not merely seen polish. He had seen deceit. The compartments that looked most recently used did not hold the expected sorts in their expected quantities. In one were slugs and spacing material that had no business being there. In another, tucked below a thin layer of ordinary type, were 2 engraved plates wrapped in wax paper. Pell gave a gasp that would have done for a maiden aunt finding a burglar in the pantry. Kramer snatched off the paper. The plates were rectangular, expertly made, and at a glance almost commonplace. At a second glance they were not. "Those aren't ours," Pell said quickly, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, not regular stock. I've never seen them." Wolfe held out his hand. Kramer hesitated, then gave him one of the plates. Wolfe studied it, turning it to catch the light from the window. The design was a formal heading, elegant script, border work, the kind of thing a printer might use for a private invitation or announcement. The wording was incomplete because it was a plate meant to be combined with type. But enough remained to make me feel a small, agreeable chill. "Midnight Mask." Below that, in smaller print, "For members and guests only." I let out a breath. "That ties up with Miss Della Vane's entertainment." "Not ties," Wolfe said. "Tangentially approaches." Kramer took the other plate from Pearlie. "This one's different." It was. Similar border, similar hand, same grade of work, but the line beneath the title carried a different date block and a small change in wording, a very small one. "If you were not looking for fraud," large enough, "if you were." Pell wiped his forehead. That's not possible. On the contrary, Wolfe said. It is actual. What I mean is, if Keene made those, why would he hide them in his own case? Wolfe handed the first plate back to Kramer and resumed his survey of the compartments. Because they were not merely plates, they were alternatives, counterfeits made to resemble originals at a glance and deceive at a reading. And this typecase was not merely for letters. It was a closet where lies changed garments. That was Wolfe at his best and worst. The line was good enough to admire and pompous enough to annoy. Kramer grunted. All right, somebody made fake invitation plates. Why kill Keene over that? Because, Mr. Kramer, counterfeit access is often more profitable than counterfeit currency. He was right. I could see the line of it already. A masked private entertainment. Invitations printed in one shop, a second set made from alternate plates, and issued to people who were not supposed to be there, or issued with altered dates, to create alibis, absences, meetings at a masked affair. Identity was already soft around the edges. Add counterfeit invitations, and you had a machine for admitting strangers under cover of elegance. Kramer was thinking along the same line, though it offended him to keep pace with Wolfe. Pell, who had access here? Pell spread his hands. Keene and I, the foreman sometimes, 2 compositors for cleanup, anyone who came into the back room if Keene allowed it. Did Keene often work alone nights? Yes, did you? That answer came a shade too quickly, and Wolfe's eyes shifted to him. Mr. Pell, he said, do not confuse brevity with innocence. Pell licked his lips. I have nothing to hide. That was a lie, and not an original one. It has been used by nearly everyone who ever had something to hide, including a banker, a bishop, and one alderman I helped send to Sing Sing. Wolfe bent again to the case. He lifted a shallow tray beneath the main rack and exposed a lower cavity intended for overflow sorts and scrap metal. It contained neither. Instead, there were 2 more wrapped items, this time smaller, and a sealed envelope. Kramer swore. Pearlie stepped closer. Pell made a little noise that might have been fear or indigestion. The wrapped items proved to be additional plates. One was for a supper club benefit, the very sort of private job Pell had mentioned. The other was a business card form, with a name altered by 1 middle initial, enough to redirect a packet or misidentify a signer. Small frauds, practical frauds. Not the hobby of a printer amusing himself. The envelope held typed notes, not a letter, just 3 lines, and a list of initials with dates beside them. AG JP DV MK under each. A series of dates and check marks. Kramer read it twice. What is this supposed to be? Wolfe did not answer at once. He had gone very still, which always made me cautious. When Wolfe is excited, he sometimes fidgets with his lips or closes his eyes. When he gets very still, it means something has slid into place, and he is deciding whether it belongs there. I said, Ag isn't me, I hope. I dislike seeing myself in lists connected with murder. No, Wolfe said. You are too expensive to abbreviate. Kramer looked up from the sheet. JP is Jonas Pyle. DV is Della Vane. Mech is Mrs. Keene. Likely enough. Ag could be anybody. Indeed, Wolfe said, but not anybody. Somebody in the same circle. Pell had sunk onto a stool. He looked pale enough to serve as stationery. I never saw those. I swear it. Then you are a poor partner, Wolfe told him. Or a dishonest one, Kramer rounded. Which is it, Pell? I don't know. I tell you I don't know. He looked from one to another of us as if appealing to a court made entirely of creditors. Keene handled the private jobs himself. He said clients wanted discretion. I didn't pry. The business was tight. We needed the money. That sounded true enough to carry some weight, not all of it. A man may avoid prying for the same reason he avoids mirrors. Wolfe pointed to the gleaming compartments. Mr. Pell, what was ordinarily kept here? Pell came reluctantly to look. He named the contents one by one, small capitals, italic sorts, border ornaments, fraction pieces, thin spaces. Wolfe nodded. And yet the compartments polished by recent use correspond not to the most frequently needed characters, but to those best suited for altering names, dates, and social formulas. Capitals, numerals, invitation ornaments, spacing material. This was not routine composition. It was revision for deception, Kramer said, meaning Keene was running a sideline, false invites, altered print jobs. Perhaps someone was using his facilities, with or without his consent. We do not yet know whether Mr. Keene was proprietor, accomplice, victim, or all three in sequence. I glanced at Pell. You knew he got a call from Delavane about a second set. He shook his head violently. Number, that's funny, I said. Because if you didn't know before, you know now, and you still haven't looked surprised enough. He stared at me, then at Wolfe, then away. Kramer saw it too. Pearlie, stay with him. Pearlie moved one step. Which was enough. Pell didn't argue. Men rarely argue with Pearlie's size when it has decided to be attentive. Wolfe had finished with the physical evidence, but not with the room. He made a slow circuit of the work table, the stone imposing surface where pages were assembled and locked into forms. There were ink smears, a knife, a rag, a box of brads, and near the back edge, a faint mark in a half-moon shape. He bent, scowled, and motioned me over. What do you see? I looked. A scratch. Poofwy. All right. A curved abrasion, perhaps made by metal. Better. I followed the curve with my eyes, and then looked at the plates Kramer was bagging. One of those. Number 2 narrow. He shifted his finger. 2 inches left. There, another matching. It took me a second, then I had it. A clasp. Yes. On what? Wolfe straightened, cheeks faintly pink from the effort of bending. A portfolio case, perhaps. Or a document wallet with metal corners and twin clasps. Something set down here repeatedly, Pell said from his stool. Keene had one black leather, for proofs and client papers. Kramer spun on him. Where is it? I don't know. That had the wrong shape. Not the words, the shape. A truthful man surprised into memory reaches for the memory. Pell had reached for caution. Wolfe turned his head and regarded him as if he were a smudge on glass. Mr. Pell, you are a timid man, and timidity frequently mates with concealment. If you continue to ration the truth, Mr. Kramer will eventually mistake you for the murderer out of sheer exasperation. Pell's hands clenched. I saw the case the night after Keene died. The room tightened. Where? Kramer snapped. In the storage closet upstairs. I was frightened. I didn't touch it. Why not tell the police? Because when I opened the closet I found Mrs. Keene there. That landed. Even Wolfe blinked. Pell hurried on, words tripping over each other now that fear had broken the dam. She said she had come for personal papers, that the police would make a mess of everything, that there was nothing important. She had the case in her hand. I backed out. I didn't want trouble. Later the case was gone. Kramer took a step toward him that made Pearlie unnecessary. You sat on that, Pell almost squeaked. I didn't know what it meant. No, Wolfe said coldly. You merely knew it meant something. There it was, the widow in the shop after the murder, a missing leather case. Hidden alternative plates in the typecase, a list of initials and dates, a masked entertainment with counterfeit invitations. The pile was getting handsome. Wolfe settled himself onto the only chair in the room sturdy enough to trust. He was breathing a little harder than he liked and angry at the room for noticing. Mr. Kramer, have the upper closet searched at once, if it has not been already thoroughly. Mr. Pell is to be held available and preferably uncomfortable. Archie, we are done here. Kramer frowned. Done? Hell you are. What does it mean? Wolfe steepled his fingers over his vest. It means Mr. Keene's case involved disguised entry, altered documents, and a clientele connected by private entertainments and commercial opportunities. It means the weapon may have been the composing stick, but the motive was composition of another sort. Somebody was rewriting access, perhaps schedules, perhaps identities. That's speech-making. It is more than you had 10 minutes ago, Kramer muttered. Something that would have blistered lacquer and turned to pearly with orders. I followed Wolfe out through the front office, where a girl at the billing desk tried hard not to stare and failed. On the sidewalk, the March wind came around the corner with bad intentions. Wolfe drew his coat tighter and glared at the street as if New York had arranged the weather personally to inconvenience him. In the cab downtown, he shut his eyes. I waited. When Wolfe wants quiet, he generally gets it. But there are times when silence in his presence is like leaving an itch unscratched. Finally, I said, "Pell knows more." "Of course. Mrs. Keene knows more." "Certainly. Jonas Pyle is somewhere in the middle of it, possibly. That was the one I wanted you to argue with." He opened one eye. Mr. Pyle bought masks and feather trim. He handled paper contracts. He attended the midnight masque. He appears on Keene's list. If he is not in the middle, then he is either near one end or at both ends alternately. That's almost playful. Number. When we reached the brownstone, Fritz had coffee waiting and Wolfe had opinions ready. We went to the office. He lowered himself into his chair with the care of a monarch sitting on inherited authority. "Archie, the Typecase has given us 3 certainties. First, alternate printing plates existed and were hidden in active use. Second, the alterations concerned private social documents and possibly business identifications. Third, Mr. Keene preserved a list of participants or targets." "Participants in what?" He pressed his lips. "That remains to be named. Counterfeit entry is rarely an end in itself. One enters to steal, blackmail, overhear, plant or meet. Since a man is dead, add betrayal." I took out my notebook. "Where do we go next?" "To the widow again, obviously. And to Mr. Pyle with less obviousness. Also, Miss Vane must produce her guest records, if any, if none her memory. I can already hear her memory, failing in a charming contralto." Then assisted. The phone rang. I got it. Saul Panzer's voice came over the wire, flat and reliable. "I found Mrs. Keene yesterday afternoon," he said. "She met Jonas Pyle in Bryant Park for 8 minutes. No touching, no smiles. Afterward she went to a locker station at Grand Central, opened compartment 214, removed something flat wrapped in brown paper, and took it to an apartment house on East 58th. The tenant is one Aileen Grant." I wrote it down and felt the back of my neck wake up. "Aileen Grant," I said. "That gives us Ag maybe," Saul said. "You want more?" "Yes. I'm on it." I hung up and faced Wolfe. He held out his hand without looking. I gave him the notebook page. He read it, shut his eyes, and leaned back. "Well," I said, "the alphabet is improving." He nodded. "Indeed, and now we have another lady, another address, and a package moving from a station locker to private keeping. That, Archie, is not clutter, it is arrangement of lies changing garments." His eyes opened. "Do not quote me. It sounds pretentious." From Wolfe, that was practically a sonnet. I leaned back and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above us, the orchids were being misted, each one receiving more care than most citizens of the Republic. In the kitchen, Fritz was probably considering what a civilized dinner required. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, namely building schemes faster than justice could sort them. In the middle of it, we now had a hidden set of plates, a frightened partner, a widow with a missing leather case, and a new woman named Aileen Grant, who had just inherited my afternoon. The Typecase had too many secrets, but it had made one thing plain. Emil Keene had not been struck down over an impulse, a quarrel, or a drunken rage. He had died because something made in metal and ink had begun to speak too clearly, and somebody had decided that a dead printer kept quieter than a living one. Chapter 5. The circulars that spoke with 2 voices when a case begins with a dead man in a printing shop and proceeds to masks, hidden plates, and station lockers. A sensible person may reasonably hope it will pause long enough to let him get his breath. Since I was working for Nero Wolfe, I had no such hope. By 10 o'clock the next morning, I was on my way downtown to visit Harold Vane, reform candidate, civic trumpet, and brother to Miss Della Vane of the architectural hat. If the family resemblance ended with the name, that was a blessing to the species. Harold Vane had campaign rooms on the 4th floor of an office building just off Park Row, where politics and paper have lived in untidy matrimony since the city was young enough to blush. The outer office contained 3 desks, 2 telephones, 4 young men with earnest neckties, and enough stale cigarette smoke to fumigate a county. A girl with steel-rimmed spectacles looked up at me as if I were either a contributor or a contagious disease. Mr. Vane is engaged. Tell him Archie Goodwin is here on behalf of Nero Wolfe. That did it. Even if they had never met Wolfe, people in trouble tended to know the name. One of the earnest neckties vanished through a door and returned within 30 seconds. Harold Vane was a lean, dark man in his early 40s with a face built out of angles and control. He had the kind of voice that is trained to sound sincere in large halls. It was an asset in politics and a handicap in conversation. His office was better than the outer room, which was not saying much. Metal files, campaign posters, city maps with colored pins, a coat tree carrying a raincoat and a conscience. He rose and offered a hand. Mr. Goodwin. Sit down. I have wanted to call on Mr. Wolfe, but the present moment is unfortunate. With you or with him? With everyone. You are here about Keene, among other things. His mouth tightened. A filthy business. We used Barrow and Keene for circulars and ward literature. I disliked Keene personally, but the work was competent. That was interesting. A man in politics does not often volunteer dislike unless he wants it on the record. I crossed my legs. What did you dislike? He was too discreet. In printing, discretion is often merely a cash basis for dishonesty. I wrote that down because it sounded rehearsed enough to matter. Did you have printing troubles with him? Not until last week. He opened a drawer, took out 2 sheets, and laid them on the desk between us. This is why I should have called Mr. Wolfe sooner. At a glance, the sheets looked identical. Same stock, same bold heading, same row of text blocks and emphatic phrases. They were campaign circulars for Vane's Reform Committee, the sort handed from stoops and corners by men who hoped to reform the city without first reforming their shoes. At second glance, they were not identical at all. Version 1 was hot enough to singe your fingers. It named 2 ward bosses and accused them outright of buying inspectors, fixing contracts, and managing vice protection through intermediaries. Version 2 said almost the same thing until it didn't. There the charges softened, shifted, and settled on petty clerks, unnamed underlings, and one harmless clerk in the Department of Markets who looked as if his most violent act had been to overwater a fern. I looked from one sheet to the other and let out a low whistle. That is pretty. It is poisonous, Vane said. The stronger one was my approved text. The softened one appeared in circulation in 3 districts. How many? We do not know. Enough to matter. One version attacked men with power. The other made me look like a reckless fool, slandering nobodies and retreating from substance. My enemies say I circulated both and meant to deny whichever proved inconvenient. Did you? His face hardened. Number I picked up the sheets again. The design was identical, down to the spacing. Only certain passages had been altered. Not rewritten whole, just nudged, softened, redirected. It was the kind of fraud that relies on similarity, not difference. Exactly the kind Wolfe had been smelling since the feather. When did you discover it? 3 days ago. A district captain brought me one from Yorkville and asked whether I had gone soft in the head. I compared it with our office copy. Since then we have located both versions in the field. How many were printed? 12,000 authorized, perhaps more unauthorized. Barrow and Keene handled the run. And Keene? He denied knowledge, then implied sabotage, then asked for 24 hours. Before that expired, he was dead. That fit too neatly to be comfortable. I held up the 2 sheets. These were printed from separate plates, not from stolen paper stock. That is what my own printer tells me now. Nearly identical forms, slight substitutions. He says the work was done by someone with access to the original layout. And if the altered version had become the only one seen, the city would have thought you wrote it yourself. Yes, his voice dropped. Whoever swapped the plates meant to turn my own words into a noose and let the city believe I tied it myself. That was good enough to keep. I made a note. He stood and went to the window. You know what this does. Not merely embarrassment. Reform depends on the belief that one means what one says. If my enemies can persuade the city, I print one accusation for idealists and another for practical men. I become not dangerous, but decorative. Was your brother-in-law involved? He turned. I have no brother-in-law. That was my mistake. Sister, then Della Vane. She is my sister, involved in what? In anything. His expression answered before his mouth did. Annoyance, then caution. Della lives in another climate. We are fond of one another when we meet rarely. She knows everyone worth knowing, and half the people not worth knowing. Beyond that, I cannot help you. When did you last attend one of her entertainments? His nostrils moved. Just enough. The midnight masque, if that is your target. Did you receive your invitation from Barrow and Keane? Yes. Did anyone attend under your name? Number. That wasn't what I asked. He looked at me and I looked back. After a moment he sat down again. I saw a man there, using a card meant for someone else. He said, I did not report it because I was not playing detective. The event was crowded, masked, and full of people practicing elegance. One more deception seemed part of the decorations. Who was the man? I don't know. Black domino, silver piping on the cloak. Silver braid and black masks, Jonas Pyle had bought both. I kept my face still, and whom was he pretending to be? Alderman Colin Drake. I knew the name. Everyone in the city who read a paper knew it. Drake was a ward boss with polished shoes, expensive friends, and the sort of civic influence that always claimed to despise vice while taxing it unofficially. Did you tell Keane? Number. But I told Keane something else. He reached for the circulars again, fingers flattening them against the desk. I told him if he did not produce the alternate forms and explain their existence, I would put him before a grand jury. And that was when? The day before he died. Well, I said, that gives him a busy final schedule. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office. Naturally, since his relation to movement was the same as a cathedral's, the room smelled faintly of cigar leaf and leather, with the house underneath it, polished wood, books, and the promise of lunch from the kitchen. No place in New York could make an honest man feel more civilized, or a liar more inconvenienced. He took one look at my face. You have acquired something. I have acquired literature. I handed him the 2 circulars and my notes. He read the first sheet, then the second, then the notes. His lips tightened. Yes, he said. That meant more from Wolfe than from most men's paragraphs. Harold Vane says 12,000 authorized circulars were printed. The missing quantity was not stolen for pulp value. 2 nearly identical versions existed at once. One named ward bosses for bribery, the other redirected blame towards small clerks and harmless men. Same trick as the midnight masque invitations, alternate plates, same wardrobe, different face. Wolfe nodded. And the purpose? To discredit him either way. If the strong version appeared, his enemies were provoked. If the weak version spread, he looked cowardly or duplicitous. Good, continue. He also saw a man at the midnight masque, using a card meant for Alderman Colin Drake. Black domino, silver piping on the cloak. That got him. Not much, just the slight lift of his brows that for Wolfe was fireworks. Ah, you knew Drake's name would ring. Mr. Drake is one of the ward bosses accused in the stronger circular. He was also, according to Mr. Pyle's social gossip file, which I compelled from you yesterday, a frequent guest at entertainments where respectable corruption and disreputable respectability exchange hats. That was Wolfe. Even when he was pleased, he had to make it sound like a judgment on civilization. I leaned on my desk. So now the pattern is fat enough to pet counterfeit invitations, counterfeit circulars, alternate versions designed to shift identity or blame. Keen's shop was making doubles. Number Wolfe's voice sharpened. Do not vulgarize it. A counterfeit seeks to pass as sole reality. This scheme required paired realities, two voices speaking from one mouth. That is subtler and more dangerous, because it lets the target hang himself with either statement. Precisely. He took off his spectacles, polished them, and put them back on. That is a sign with him. It means the facts have begun to organize themselves into ranks. At that moment, the front bell rang. A minute later, Fritz ushered in Saul Panzer, who moved with the mild efficiency of a man who never wastes motion, because he never wastes thought. Saul sat. Eileen Grant is 29, unmarried, occupation uncertain in the official sense and decorative in the practical one. She has an apartment on East 58th, modest rent, better clothes than her declared means. Yesterday, Mrs. Keen delivered a flat brown paper package there. 40 minutes later, Jonas Pyle arrived. He left carrying a black leather portfolio case. That landed squarely on the mark. The missing case from the printing shop, I said. Likely, Saul said. Pyle then went to an office building on Madison and met Alderman Colin Drake in a private suite, used by Drake's political club, stayed 23 minutes. Wolfe shut his eyes. I know that look, to outsiders it resembles drowsiness. It is actually a private celebration. So, I said, our alphabet improves again. Ag may be Eileen Grant. Ja P is almost certainly Jonas Pyle. Davi is Delavone. MK is Mrs. Keen. They all orbit counterfeit printing and masked social affairs. I dislike the company already. Wolfe opened his eyes. What of Harold Vane's temperament? Controlled, smart, self-righteous enough to mean some of it. He threatened Keen with a grand jury if the alternate circulars were not explained. Could he have killed him? Possibly he has motive. He also has the rigid posture of a man who would rather prosecute a murderer than become one. I wouldn't clear him, but I wouldn't bet dinner on him either. I gave him a closer look. You have a thought I won't like. Several. One of them is that Mr. Keen may have attempted to blackmail his collaborators or clients. Men who produce alternate truths often become collectors of obligations. That had weight. A printer who knew which invitations were false, which circulars had been softened, which names had been inserted or removed, would be useful until he became greedy. After that, he would be dead, which was a brutal but economical civic custom. The phone rang again. I took it. It was Della Vane, and her contralto had sharpened overnight. Mr. Goodwin, I have discovered that one of my guest ledgers is missing. That is the sort of thing people mention sooner. I am mentioning it now. Was it stolen before or after your brother's circular trouble? A pause. What do Harold's campaign papers have to do with me? In this town, often more than people prefer, I want to see Mr. Wolfe. You and half the city. Today, I looked at Wolfe. He had been watching me and now nodded once. 4 o'clock, I told her. When I hung up, Wolfe said, Good. The lady has been squeezed by circumstance and has begun to leak. That is not a gracious metaphor. She is not a gracious woman. Lunch arrived then, which in Wolfe's house is not an interruption but a principle. Fritz served kidneys with mustard sauce, braised endive, little potatoes browned in butter, and a tart so delicate it deserved a bishop. Conversation ceased, because Fritz considered speech at table an admission that the food required assistance afterward. With coffee in the office, Wolfe resumed. Archie, let us tabulate. A printer's shop produced alternate plates for private invitations and political circulars. The changes were not random but strategic. One altered entry to a social event. Another altered public blame in a civic attack. Both serve power. Both protect some persons while exposing others. Who profits? What bosses? Brokers? Anyone selling access? Anyone needing plausible deniability? Yes, and maybe Della Vane, if her entertainments were being used as a sorting room for blackmail, introductions, or payoffs. And Jonas Pyle, if he was handling paper contracts as a front for handling paper identities. That pleased him enough to make him grunt rather than snap. At 4 o'clock, Della Vane arrived in grey this time, which on her looked like expensive impatience. She sat without being asked, which told me nerves were running ahead of manners. "My ledger is missing," she said. "The smaller one. Guest notations, table placements, special requests." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "And why should that concern me?" "Because Emil Keene had seen it." "Under what circumstances?" "I showed it to him when we discussed the invitations. He wanted to compare spellings of guest names and club affiliations. Certain people are sensitive to titles." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Did he also compare which guests might prefer not to meet one another in public?" Her eyes flicked. "Not much, but enough." "I manage a room," she said. "That includes frictions. That includes leverage," Wolfe corrected. She ignored that. "If the ledger is gone, then someone may know who attended, under what names, and where they were placed." "Placed for what?" She pressed her lips. "Conversation," I said. "That is a roomy word." She turned to me. "Mr. Goodwin, many people at such evenings prefer to encounter one another by arrangement while pretending it was chance. Is that blunt enough for you? It is a start." Wolfe's gaze never left her. "Miss Vane, did your brother Harold know that alternate circulars had been printed?" "Number did Jonas Pyle." She was silent. "Ah," Wolfe said. "Then he did." Her chin rose. "I did not say that. You did not need to. Mr. Pyle attended your entertainment, purchased costume materials, met Mrs. Keene, and now holds a missing leather case from the printing shop. If you continue to preserve his comfort, you may have to do so in a witness chair." That shook her, not visibly to civilians, perhaps, but to me it sounded in the breath. Finally, she said, "Pyle told me there were 2 sets of circular plates. He said it was politics, that smoothing language prevented unnecessary scandal." "Whose scandal?" She looked at the carpet. "His Drake's others." There it was. Not enough to close the fist, but enough to feel bone. After she had gone, I stood by my desk and looked at Wolfe. "Now what?" "Now," he said, "we cease admiring the pattern and begin using it." "How?" "By compelling movement. These people have operated through substitution, redirection, and paired texts. Therefore they fear direct comparison. We shall provide it." I waited. He leaned back, eyes half closed. "Invite Harold Vane, Della Vane, Jonas Pyle, Mrs. Keene, Leonard Pell, and Mr. Cramer here tomorrow evening. Also Alderman Colin Drake." I stared. "You're collecting a better class of headache." "Yes. For what purpose? To hear 2 voices speak at once and determine which throat cannot bear the strain." That was Wolfe, and it was the kind of line that meant he had 1 foot on the solution and expected me to provide the other legwork. I made the calls. Naturally, Harold Vane accepted with suspicious eagerness. Pell accepted like a man agreeing to have a tooth drawn. Mrs. Keene hesitated, and then said yes. Pyle was unavailable until he learned Cramer would attend, after which he became available at once. Drake sent a secretary to say the alderman's public duties were heavy, but when I mentioned Nero Wolfe and possible relevance to campaign defamation and homicide, the duties lightened remarkably. By 6:30 the office was quiet again. Wolfe was reading, which for him means he is not reading but thinking with a book as camouflage. I was at my desk with the 2 circulars spread before me. They looked almost the same. That was the beauty and the cruelty of it. One version named the men who mattered, the other protected them and wrecked the speaker instead. Whoever swapped the plates had not meant merely to alter a pamphlet. He had meant to turn Harold Vane's own reform words into a trap and let the city believe he had baited and sprung it himself. New York is a town that likes reform the way a diner likes clean table linen, provided it does not delay the meal. Give the city 2 versions of one man's courage, and it will always suspect the cheaper one. Someone had known that, and had printed accordingly. Across the room, Wolfe turned a page without looking at it. "You are brooding," he said. "I'm admiring civilization." "Do not. It encourages it." I looked again at the circulars. 2 voices, 1 mouth, 1 truth, 1 mask, in Keene's shop. Plates had been hidden behind ordinary fonts as if lies needed only a shallow drawer to live in comfort. Now the lies were out walking in daylight, and by tomorrow evening Wolfe intended to seat them in his office and make them talk. Chapter 6. A printer's signal disguised as nonsense by 9 o'clock. The next morning Leonard Pell had already lied to me twice, apologized 3 times, and looked as if a stiff breeze might reduce him to correspondence. He was in the office on West 35th Street, balanced on the edge of the red leather chair, with both hands on his knees, the posture of a man who has come to confess but hopes to be spared the details. Wolfe sat behind his desk, massive and motionless, his eyes half closed. That look fools strangers. They take it for drowsiness when it is actually concentration sharpening its knives. I was at my desk with a notebook ready, because when Wolfe finally squeezes truth out of a reluctant witness, it usually comes in a rush. Pell swallowed. "I have told you everything I know." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Number, you have told us everything you believe can be admitted without immediate discomfort. That is not the same thing." Pell turned to me as if I might offer asylum. I didn't. Wolfe's voice stayed quiet, which made it worse. "Mr. Pell, private jobs were run late at night. Cash was paid. Alternative plates were hidden in your typecase. Mrs. Keene removed a leather portfolio after her husband's death. Your shop printed paired texts meant to deceive at a reading, yet you ask us to believe you noticed nothing until murder made silence inconvenient. PFW. Pell's face twitched. I was afraid. Of whom? I don't know. Then your fear was merely laziness in a dark coat. That landed. Pell flushed and gripped his knees harder. There was a man, not Pyle, another one. Wolfe did not move. Name. I only heard it twice. Jonas Creed. I wrote it down, Wolfe said. Description. Medium height, thin, pale eyes. Never removed his gloves. He came after hours and always acted as if he were doing us a favor by entering the premises. He paid cash, crisp bills. He said he represented clients who valued discretion. Clients such as, I was never told. Keene dealt with him directly. Yet you saw him. Yes, 3 times, maybe 4, always at night. He brought copy already marked. Sometimes partial plates wrapped in paper, sometimes lists of corrections, dates, initials, titles, seating names, that kind of thing. I said, and you never asked questions. He looked at me miserably. Mr. Goodwin, in a small shop, a partner, asks fewer questions than a policeman thinks he should. Business was poor. Keene said it was profitable work, and none of my concern. Wolfe snorted. A creed suitable to bankruptcy and prison. Pell ignored that because he had no choice. At first I thought it was only private club printing, invitations, place cards, circular revisions. Then I noticed something odd. Wolfe leaned back a fraction. The feather. Pell blinked. Yes. That was the first firm note in his voice, because at last he had reached the thing that had been haunting him. It appeared the morning after one of Creed's late jobs, just one blue feather stuck in the upper right groove of Keene's case. I threw it away. I thought it was a joke. Then after another night run there was one again, same place, same bright blue. I asked Keene what childish fool had been decorating the furniture. He told me to mind my own business. What did you infer? Wolfe asked. At first, nothing. Then one evening I came in early and found Keene changing out a plate on the stone, not replacing a whole form, just a portion, quickly, as if he didn't want to be seen. Later the feather was there again. He stopped. The room was quiet except for a taxi grumbling outside and the faint house sounds from below stairs. So, Wolfe said, you connected them. Pell nodded. Yes, I began to understand the feather meant the false plates had been inserted. It was a signal ridiculous to look at, but clear if you knew. A printer's signal disguised as nonsense. I said, why use a feather? I don't know. Because it was conspicuous and silly. No one would think it meant anything. If a job had been altered, the feather appeared. If it hadn't, no feather. Wolfe's lips pressed together, childish on its face and deadly in effect. Yes, Pell whispered. And you remained silent. Pell gave a little shudder. What would I have said? That my partner was helping a cash customer alter private documents. I had no proof, only a feather and a feeling. Then the circulars appeared in 2 versions, and I knew by then it was too late. The shop had become an accomplice without consent. I let that sit a moment. It had the right sound and the wrong comfort. Men like Pell always want innocence to remain available if phrased delicately enough. You could have walked out, I told him. Yes. You could have gone to the police. Yes. You could have told somebody before Keane got his head cracked. His eyes dropped. Yes. Wolfe lifted a hand slightly, stopping me. He wanted the rest, while Pell was still open. Mr. Creed, Wolfe said. Did he ever mention Pyle? Number. But once I heard Keane tell him, Pyle wants the gentler version first. I remember it because the phrase struck me, gentler version, as if words were medicine being sweetened for children. That was worth a page of guesses. And the feather, Wolfe said. Who placed it? I never saw, but I believe Creed did, or Keane after Creed left. It marked completion. It told the next man the substitution had been made. Wolfe closed his eyes. Yes. That meant the thing had settled in his mind where he wanted it. I looked at Pell. He had sagged now, some inner brace gone out of him. He was not relieved. He was merely tired of carrying a secret too flimsy to respect and too dangerous to discard. The blue feather had started as absurdity, then property, then message. Now it had become what it had been all along, a shop signal, cheap, visible, and deadly. In a room full of honest type and dead metal, it announced that the lies were in place and ready to print. Chapter 7. Riddle Street after dark that evening. With the city damp from a late drizzle and the pavements reflecting lamps like bad intentions, I went back to Riddle Street. A man can spend years in New York and still find streets that seem to have been omitted from the official conscience. Riddle Street after dark was one of them. By day it dealt in theatrical leftovers, trunks, fake jewels, moldy velvet, and second-hand splendor. By night it kept the same goods in the windows and changed the traffic on the sidewalks. The cabs that stopped there were better than the shops required. The men who got out of them wore hats, pulled low and overcoats that had seen both weather and caution. Nobody hurried, and nobody loitered by accident. Wolfe had sent me because Saul was elsewhere, and because, as he put it, you possess a vulgar aptitude for entering dubious places without seeming either astonished or edible. I took that as praise, since with him it usually was. Lorimer costume and theatrical supply was closed in front, the gilt letters blind in the wet shine from the street lamp. But there was light in the side alley, and from the alley a narrow stair climbed to a rear entrance on the second floor of the adjoining building. I walked past once, then doubled back and took the stair. At the top was a door with frosted glass and no lettering. A small panel slid open. 2 eyes looked out. Yes, I was told there might be a game. The eyes studied me, decided I looked solvent enough to fleece, and the door opened. It was not a large room, but it was crowded with smoke, whispers, and the kind of politeness that comes from knowing fists and money are both nearby. 3 card tables were occupied. Along one wall stood a bar with bottles, honest enough to kill a man but too expensive to do it cheaply. There were perhaps 20 men in all, with 2 women among them, one bored and one professionally cheerful. Ward heelers, political runners, hired speakers, campaign errand boys, messengers who could carry rumors farther than envelopes, and the sort of fixers who never seem to hold office because offices are too public. No roulette wheels, no fanfare, no gaudy vice, just cards, drinks, talk and transactions that preferred not to meet daylight. The little man behind the bar knew me for a stranger but not for a cop, which was the essential point. I ordered rye, paid cash, and stood where I could hear while looking as if I was trying not to. That is a gift. I have it. Within 10 minutes, I had 3 names I already knew, and one I didn't want. Jonas Piles was mentioned twice, both times with the careful casualness men use when referring to a banker who may also own their signatures. Alderman Colin Drake's came with less care and more resentment. Harold Vane's came with laughter, which in politics is often a form of hate. The new name was Bix Morrow, a hired speaker for ward rallies, a man with a barrel chest and a voice like somebody dragging a rake over slate. He was at the far table losing money with injured dignity and telling anyone within 6 feet that reformers always discover honesty just after the last honest train has left. I drifted near enough to listen. Across from him sat a round-faced little fellow in a pearl tea-pin who said, "Vane was going to shout it from the courthouse steps." Morrow snorted. He was going to shout a lot. That's what he was for. "No, I mean it, he had the sheets." "What sheets?" "The forged broadsides, the ones against his own people." That tightened me up internally while I kept my face bland and my glass at my chin. Morrow leaned in. "Against which people?" "The district men who backed him early. The clean ones, broadside, saying they were in with Drake after all, skimming subscriptions and taking city envelopes, real poison, printed to look like Vane committee stuff." Morrow gave a low whistle, and he found out. "The night before, that's what I heard." "From who?" The round-faced fellow glanced around, then lowered his voice, which only made me listen harder. "From Creed's slip. A packet got crossed. He saw the wrong proofs." There it was, Creed again, Jonas Creed, the middleman Pell had described, walking in cash and late, night instructions. Morrow took a drink. "So what did Vane do?" "What he always did, decided to be noble in public. He was going to expose the whole business the next morning." "Next morning after what?" "After the row at Keen's place." That got me. Not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it in a room that sold silence gave it more weight. Morrow shook his head. "Then he learned too much too late. City doesn't kill a candidate for what he believes. It kills him for what he learns to read." That was a line worth stealing, and I did. I moved off before either of them noticed I had ears. At the bar I paid for another drink. I didn't want and let the rest of the room talk at me in pieces. Pyle's name with deliveries, Drake's with protection, Delavane's with guest lists, Eileen Grant's with keeping things where ladies keep them better than clerks. And always the sense underneath it that printed matter had become a currency more dangerous than cash cards, broadsides, circulars, invitations. All of them passed names the way sharpers pass marked decks. After a while I found my way to the rear hall and down a short corridor that smelled of dust and powder. There was a connecting door, locked, to the back of Lorimer's costume house. That interested me. Not because it proved anything by itself, but because it meant Riddle Street's feathers. Masks and capes were not merely for hire. The costume supplier linked directly to the backroom gambling club, and the club linked ward fixers, hired speakers, and campaign errand boys in one cozy arrangement. They traded names as if dealing cards, and traded identities with only slightly more care. On my way out, I got a better look at the doorman, and memory nudged me. He had the same silver braid on the edge of his black vest that Lorimer had shown me with the costume trims. Not proof, just family resemblance between trades, and that was enough for my mood. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the street still shone black and blue under the lamps. I walked to the avenue and found a telephone booth. Wolfe answered on the second ring. "Yes, Archie. I have a cheerful report from civilization. Lorimer's place connects by rear door to a gambling club upstairs and over full of ward fixers, hired speakers, and campaign errand boys. Pyle's name circulates there, Drake's too. Also I heard that Harold Vane discovered forged broadsides attacking his own allies and intended to expose the scheme the next morning." "After his death?" Wolfe asked sharply. "Number after Keen's death," I misspoke. "He planned to expose it the morning after he learned of them, which was apparently the morning after the row at Keen's shop." "Ah," one man said. "Vane saw the wrong proofs because of Creed's slip." Silence. Then Wolfe said, "Excellent." That from him was as good as applause and twice as unsettling. I also confirm the city is not merely buying false invitations and softened circulars. It is running a whole exchange in names, broadsides, guest lists, campaign sheets. They pass them around like trading cards. "Yes," Wolfe said. And what do children do with cards, Archie? Cheat. Number before that. I frowned into the receiver. Swap them. Precisely, return at once. He hung up, which is Wolfe's way of implying that if I had been intelligent enough, I would not still be in a booth. Back in the office an hour later, I found him in his chair with his eyes shut and his fingertips together. That is not prayer. With Wolfe it is architecture. I gave him the room, the talk, the names, the connecting door, and Morrow's line about the city killing a candidate. Not for what he believed, but for what he learned to read. At that Wolfe opened his eyes. Yes, he said softly. That is very near it. I sat at my desk. Then say the rest. Not yet. But we now know this scheme had breadth. Counterfeit invitations were only one use. Altered circulars, forged broadsides, redirected blame, managed introductions. Mr. Keene's shop was an instrument for political ventriloquism. That sounds painful. It should. One man speaks, another's words emerge. Mr. Vane ceased to be useful when he learned the mechanism. I thought of Riddle Street after dark. The smoke, the cards, the lazy voices naming men as if ownership came with pronunciation. So they didn't move against him because he was a reformer. Of course not. Reformers are plentiful and often ornamental. They moved when he became literate in fraud. That was Wolfe. Cold, exact, and unpleasantly convincing. I looked at my notes again. Riddle Street, Lorimer, the Rear Club, Pyle Drake, Creed, Keene, Vane, printed lies dressed in costumes, walking through side doors, seating themselves in politics and calling it public life. The city had not tried to destroy a candidate for what he believed. Belief is cheap in New York and sold retail. It had moved to silence men because they had finally learned to read the hidden text behind the public one. Emil Keene had known too much and kept it in plates and lists. Harold Vane had seen too much and meant to speak. Somewhere in between, with cash in his pocket and false papers under his arm, Jonas Creed had walked through the machinery and left a blue feather behind like a child's joke. Only, it wasn't a joke. It was a signal. And by then, in Wolfe's office, I was beginning to understand that every signal in the case had been designed not merely to pass unnoticed, but to look foolish to anyone who did notice. That is the best disguise in the world. Give murder a serious face, and people get suspicious. Give it a bright feather, a mask, a broadsheet, and a club door in Riddle Street, and half the city will call it nonsense until the coffin closes. Chapter 8. The man who changed words by 11, the next morning, the office on West 35th Street, had the look it gets when Nero Wolfe's mind is moving faster than the furniture. He was in his chair, naturally, but the room had taken on that hard stillness, which means he has stopped collecting facts and started arranging them. On my desk were notes on Harold Vane, Della Vane, Jonas Pyle, Leonard Pell, Aileen Grant, Colin Drake, Sidney Lorimer, and the newest addition, Jonas Creed, the middleman with pale eyes and good gloves. The notes had begun to resemble an infestation. Wolfe had said very little over breakfast and nothing at all during the 10 minutes after, which with him is either deep thought or indigestion. Since Fritz had served eggs with truffles and kidneys in cream, I ruled out indigestion. At last Wolfe opened his eyes and said, "Archie, get Mr. Kramer." That was all. I phoned the inspector and told him Wolfe had reached the stage of arrogance where facts might shortly become useful. Kramer said something coarse, then promised to come. While we waited, Saul Panzer arrived with the kind of face he wears when he has found the piece he was sent to find, and 2 more, nobody requested. He sat. Creed is real. Jonas Creed. No fixed office, no registered business, known to a few printers and 1 lithographer as a cash middleman for discreet jobs. He rents a room under another name on East 21st. Last night he left there with a valise, took a cab downtown, and entered the side door of the Municipal Committee Club on Lexington. Wolfe grunted. "Whose club?" "Councilman Orrin Bale's organization uses the back rooms twice a week." I looked up from my notebook. Orrin Bale, Harold Vane's public supporter. Saul nodded. "Public supporter? Yes, private habits less devotional. He and Bale have shared platforms, but not trust." That name had been on the edges of the case without stepping into the room. Councilman Orrin Bale was one of those smooth municipal gentlemen who smile as if public service had just been invented, and they were too modest to mention their role in it. He had backed Vane's reform candidacy in speeches and photographs, all while carefully avoiding enthusiasm sharp enough to cut his own arrangements. Men like Bale support reform the way a gambler supports sobriety in other people, Wolfe said. Did Creed meet Bale? He met Bale's secretary, then left an hour later with an empty valise. I said. That puts Bale close to Creed, but close is not enough. Wolfe turned to me. Number but proximity plus necessity plus language may be. That last word snagged me. Language. He ignored the question because Kramer arrived. Then, with Pearlie behind him and resentment in front, Kramer planted himself in the red leather chair as if he were arresting it. Well, Wolfe put a finger on the sheaf of notes before him. Mr. Kramer, Jonas Creed is not your mastermind. That stopped him. He had been prepared for a name and got a subtraction instead. Who the hell said he was? I say now that he is not. He is the mechanic. Kramer's scowl deepened. Speak English. Wolfe obliged with reluctance. Creed carried plates, delivered copy, collected altered proofs, placed the blue feather as a signal that substitution had been completed, and maintained the silence of printers through confusion and compartmentalization. He was useful precisely because he understood process and not purpose. I said, the man who changed words without needing to own them. Exactly, Wolfe said. A mechanic, necessary, dangerous, and subordinate. Kramer leaned forward. Subordinate to who? Wolfe reached for a page I recognized at once. Harold Vane's two circulars, the true and the softened. Beside them he placed a typed copy of one of Councilman Bale's recent campaign statements, which I had fetched from newspaper morgues that morning at Wolfe's instruction, and without any explanation worth the name. Councilman Orrin Bale, Wolfe said. The room took that in. Pearlie's face altered by perhaps 1/8 of an inch, which for him was astonishment. Kramer only blinked once, but it was a solid blink. I leaned back and let Wolfe have the floor, because when he has finally decided to use it, interruption is both pointless and bad for your health. Bale, Kramer said. Why? Because he needed two contradictory results from one operation. Harold Vane's reform candidacy threatened to consolidate independent voters, district idealists, and certain respectable donors who had grown weary of paying for vice protection under cleaner names. Bale could not attack Vane openly without losing those voters. Therefore he supported him publicly and undermined him privately. I said, false circulars to split the reform vote. Yes, one version of Vane's circular named ward bosses directly, inflaming enemies and isolating him from negotiation. The alternate version softened those charges and redirected blame toward petty clerks and harmless men, making Vane appear either cowardly or duplicitous, according to which audience received which sheet, a neat division. Reformers despise him for compromise. Machine men fear him for boldness. And the city concludes, he says whatever suits the block he is standing on. Kramer grunted. That's politics. Dirty but not murder. No, Wolfe said. Murder entered when Vane recognized the phrasing. That got me. It got Kramer too. The phrasing, he said. Wolfe picked up the forged circular and tapped a paragraph with one thick forefinger. This passage, Mr. Goodwin. I had it ready. Wolfe had made me compare Bale's published speeches and committee letters against the forged text until my eyes wanted union representation. I read aloud, administrative rot thrives less by grand larceny than by tolerated little obediences. Wolfe nodded. Now from Bale's address to the Civic Trades Association, printed 6 weeks ago. I read the second slip. Municipal rot feeds less on spectacular theft than on tolerated little obediences. Kramer frowned. That could be coincidence. No, Wolfe said flatly. Because there are 7 such correspondences, not exact quotations. Revisions. Bale habitually builds sentences by pairing an abstract noun with a minimizing adjective and a moralizing plural. He prefers tolerated little obediences, harmless accommodations, practical municipal necessities, and regrettable informal usages. He softens corruption by revision. In the forged circular, Vane's direct accusations are systematically diluted into Bale's own style. I let that sit. It was beautiful in a nasty way. Most men reveal themselves by speech, Wolfe said. Bale revealed himself by revision. Kramer let out a breath through his nose. You're saying Vane knew Bale well enough to hear him inside the forgery. Precisely, Mr. Vane may not have recognized the plates, the messenger, or the logistics. But when he saw his own words altered into Bale's cadences, he understood at once who had been standing behind the printer's devils. That is why he intended exposure, not of generic fraud, of a specific hand. I said, and Bale, smiling public supporter and private enemy, couldn't allow that. Wolfe inclined his head. A public alliance is easy to maintain until one party learns the bookkeeping. Kramer rubbed the back of his neck. All right, Creed mechanics it. Bale orders it. Where does Keane die? In greed or panic, Wolfe said. Likely both. Keane's shop was the instrument. He knew about the paired plates, the guest lists, the counterfeit invitations, the broadsides against Vane's allies, the whole machinery of redirected texts. At some point he either demanded more money or threatened disclosure. When Mr. Vane also recognized Bale's phrasing, the pressure became intolerable. By Bale himself? I asked. Wolfe's eyes shifted to me. Perhaps not by his own hand. Men like Bale prefer signatures that cannot be compared with their speeches. Jonas Creed may have arranged the meeting, and Jonas Pyle may have helped channel payments or access. But the design is Bale's. There was a knock and Fritz entered with coffee. He moved with grave precision, placed cups and departed, leaving the aroma behind as a civilized rebuke to the subject under discussion. Kramer drank his too hot, which Wolfe noticed and despised. I said, "Where does Delavane fit now?" Wolfe answered at once. As facilitator without full comprehension, her entertainments provided controlled encounters under masks. Invitations could be duplicated, names shifted, introductions arranged, absences manufactured. She knew she was smoothing dangerous company together, but not necessarily the full political application. And Eileen Grant. A custodian, a safe apartment, a prettier address for keeping ledgers, guest books, or cases too compromising for club lockers. And Pell, a cowardly witness who read the signal and refused the sentence. Kramer set down his cup. This is all elegant, Wolfe, but I need something I can put in cuffs. You shall have it tonight. That was Wolfe again. He said it the way other men say, please pass the salt. Kramer's eyes narrowed. How? By making Bale revise aloud. I stared at him. That's not a full set of instructions. Number it is an announcement, Archie. This evening our gathering proceeds as planned. Add Councilman Bale and Jonas Creed. Mr. Kramer, oblige us by ensuring Mr. Creed attends, voluntarily, or with the minimum necessary correction to his preferences. Kramer stood. If this turns into one of your parlors without a body at the end of it, I'll roast you. Wolfe fluttered fingers. You have been threatening that for years and remain raw. After they had gone, leaving coffee cups and a healthier quantity of oxygen, I looked across at Wolfe. You're pleased with yourself. Number, you've only solved the part that interests you. Yes. That was honest enough to count. I got up and crossed to the window. Outside, New York was going about its civic exercises, cabs lunging, delivery boys risking eternity, pedestrians hurrying to appointments where somebody would lie to them for practical reasons. Somewhere downtown Orrin Bale was probably smiling over luncheon and speaking well of Harold Vane's principles in a room full of men who preferred principles dead, diluted, or divided by district. Bale, I said. I saw him once at City Hall. Good teeth, warm handshake. He looked like the sort of man who sends flowers to widows and bills departments for the ribbon. Wolfe grunted. A common species. And Vane caught him because of a phrase. Not a phrase, a habit. That is the point. Men may counterfeit words, Archie, but they rarely counterfeit their method of altering them. Bale's mind works by sanding edges. He does not deny vice, He domesticates it. He does not erase guilt. He redistributes it downward. In those forged circulars, Mr. Vane encountered not merely false statements, but Bale's very manner of falsification. That had the hard ring of truth. Some men write with ink, others with fingerprints. I went back to my desk and started making calls for the evening assembly. Della Vane answered on the second ring and sounded like a woman who had stopped sleeping and did not admire the alternative. Harold Vane accepted in a clipped voice that had shed all public music. Pell agreed in the tone of a man reporting for his own autopsy. Pyle said he would come after I told him Bale would be here. Mrs. Keene said yes after a silence long enough to suggest calculation, and not long enough to suggest innocence. Bale's secretary objected until I mentioned Inspector Kramer and homicide, at which point municipal duties again became accommodating creed. I left to the police. When the calls were done, Wolfe had closed his eyes again. "You know," I said, "most people use revision to improve a sentence." He didn't open his eyes. Most people should not revise anything. They worsen the world already drafted. I looked down at the forged circular, at the changed accusations, the softened charges, the harmless little clerks substituted for men with actual power. Bale had tried to defeat Vane without ever standing against him openly. He had praised him in public, revised him in private, and when Vane finally learned to hear the true author inside the forgery, somebody died. The city likes its betrayals dressed well. That was the whole trick. A loud enemy is manageable. A smiling supporter who changes 3 words in a paragraph can alter a district, ruin a candidate, redirect blame, and send a printer to his death. Jonas Creed had carried plates and feathers like a mechanic. With a toolbox, Orrin Bale had supplied the design, and that evening, Wolfe intended to put them all in one room and make revision answer to fact. Chapter 9. The trap set in laid Nero. Wolfe does not often lay traps in person. It offends both his habits and his digestion. He prefers that truth, once properly provoked, come to him indoors and sit down. But there are cases in which a man must either move a little or abandon the right to sneer at those who do. This was one of them. By 6 o'clock, that evening Leonard Pell's shop was open in front, dark in back, and waiting. Wolfe had designed the bait with the exactness of a man planning a dinner for cannibals. Through Pell, under suitable protest and trembling, a message had gone out by channels we expected would reach Jonas Creed. A client of means required an expensive private job, rush handling, late night revision possible. Cash, discretion essential. The wording had been Wolfe's, softened in spots by me so it would not sound as if a dictionary had written it in a rage. If Bale's machinery was still operating, if Creed remained its mechanic, and if the blue feather truly marked completed substitution, then an attractive job laid before the old channel ought to bring him to hand. Wolfe, having built the theory on patience and comparison, proposed to test it with a typecase, a false commission, and Inspector Kramer, waiting close enough to smell hot ink. At 7:30, I was in the rear composing room with the lights lowered and a cigarette I didn't intend to smoke. Kramer and Pearlie were in the next room beyond the partition, where a cracked pane above the door gave them a narrow view of the stone. And the cases. Pell was with them, because Wolfe insisted that a trap laid in a printer's shop should include its owner, if only to improve the moral lesson. Wolfe himself was not visible. That was his idea, and mine too. He had placed a chair in the little proofing alcove off the side passage, from which he could see the work table if the door stood open 3 inches. He detests drafts, grit, noise, vulgar walls, and being abroad after dinner, so his willingness to sit there for even 20 minutes was proof of either devotion to truth or murderous irritation. With Wolfe, the distinction is narrow. I checked my watch, 7:38. The press room smelled of ink, oil, dust, and old paper. The honest smells of a trade being used for dishonest work. A single shaded lamp burned above the stone. On it lay the bait, a set of dummy proofs for a private civic dinner, all flourish and expense. We had included enough names and titles to suggest a profitable circle and enough blank places to invite tampering. Pell had left the typecase as it had been found, cleaned up but not cleaned out. If Creed came, he would see the old road open. At 7:56, the front bell jangled once. I stood where I was. A moment later came the soft scrape of the rear door opening, then footsteps, careful and unhurried. Not a customer. A man who already knew the floorboards. He came into the composing room in gloves and a dark overcoat, carrying a flat leather case. Medium height, thin, pale eyes. No haste. Jonas Creed, exactly as Pell had described him, with the calm of a mechanic answering a service call. He saw me at once and stopped. I was told Pell would be here. "He is," I said. "Occupied. You must be Creed." His eyes rested on me without liking it. "Who are you?" "Archie Goodwin. I'm handling the client's interest." That gave him a pause. Wolfe's name had not been used in the message. Good. It let him come in believing greed might be on the table instead of justice. Creed looked at the proofs on the stone. Private dinner. That's what they call it when the guests are richer than the food. He did not smile. What revisions? Depends what the client wants revised. He set the leather case on the table and touched the top proof with one gloved finger. "You have copy." Pell said you were the man who knew how these things are managed. He glanced toward the typecase, then back to me. The pale eyes were good eyes for bad work. Cool, impersonal, able to measure risk without showing the sums. "Pell talks too much," he said. "Tonight, I'm hoping you will." He had almost decided to leave then. I saw it in the slight shift of his shoulders. What held him was the old temptation. Cash speed, discretion, an accustomed room. A job whose corruption looked routine. That was Wolfe's real trap. Not the police in the next room. Habit. Creed opened the case. Inside were 2 wrapped plates, a packet of corrected text slips, and, in the narrow inner pocket, a bundle of blue feathers. From the side, alcove, came Wolfe's voice, cold and deep and carrying no hurry at all. "Yes, Mr. Creed, continue. It is most instructive." Creed spun. Wolfe filled the doorway, one hand on the jamb, massive and immovable, his face set in a satisfaction so severe it looked almost like disgust. He had the patience of a guillotine, and about as much warmth. Creed backed one step. Another sound came from behind, as Kramer and Pearlie entered through the partition door. That closed the square. For one instant Creed looked at all of us and made the arithmetic. Front blocked, rear blocked. Pell peering white, faced over Pearlie's shoulder. Wolfe in the side door, Kramer with both hands free and temper available. The leather case open, plates visible, feathers in plain sight. Kramer said, "Don't be foolish." Creed was not foolish. He did not lunge, or shout, or try innocence by performance. He stood very still. Wolfe said, "Mr. Creed, you carried plates, delivered revised copy, and placed a blue feather to indicate that substitution had been completed. You may now save time by confirming what is already known." Creed's mouth moved slightly. "I want counsel." "You shall have it," Kramer said, "after you explain the hardware." No answer. Kramer took one step forward. "Those plates, Creed." Creed looked at the case, and then oddly, at the typecase. The old working relation between his hands and the drawers had been caught in the act. It seemed to offend him that the room itself had betrayed him. The feather marked a night on which false plates had been inserted. Mr. Pell observed that pattern without understanding its scope. "We arranged this little experiment to see whether you would repeat your custom. You have done so, gratifyingly." Creed turned his head. "You can't prove anything from a feather." "No," Wolfe said. "But from the feather, the plates, the revised copy, the matching schedule of nights, the forged circulars, the duplicated invitations, and your presence in this room, we can prove quite a lot. The question is whether you wish to stand between the mechanism and its architect." That touched him. Not much. Enough. Kramer saw it too. "Who gave the orders?" Creed kept his mouth shut. Wolfe said, "Councilman Orrin Bale." Creed's eyes flicked, and that was his mistake. Kramer grunted. "Thanks." Creed's jaw hardened. "I didn't say that." No, Wolfe replied. But you have been saying it for weeks by diligence, by selection, by obedience. Mr. Bale wrote the softened versions. He diluted charges, redirected blame, split the reform vote, and used your services to install his revisions in Mr. Keene's shop. When Harold Vane recognized Bale's phrasing in the forged text, the operation became unstable. Then Mr. Keene died. Creed looked at Wolfe fully, for the first time, not with fear, with contempt edged by fatigue. You talk too much, he said. Wolfe's lips tightened. On the contrary, I infer too much. Speech is merely the residue. Kramer reached into the case and lifted one of the plates. These for tonight too. Creed said nothing. I stepped to the table and examined the packet of corrected slips. The dummy, private dinner text had been altered exactly as Wolfe predicted. Names softened. One civic title changed. A line added to shift sponsorship from one committee to another. Small changes. Strategic ones. Same hand in spirit if not in penmanship. Bale again sanding edges, redirecting ownership downward and aside. Inspector, I said. The revisions are in place. Same system. False insertions on a supposed private job. Kramer nodded without looking at me. Creed, start talking. Perhaps it was the room, perhaps the open case, perhaps the sight of Pell frightened into witnesshood at last. Or perhaps Creed, mechanic to the end, knew when a machine had broken beyond repair. Whatever the reason, he exhaled once and let his shoulders drop. All right, he said. Nobody moved. I didn't write them, I carried them. Bale's office sent wording through his secretary, or sometimes through Pyle. I brought it to Keene. Keene made the alternate plates or had them made. I handled the swap nights because Bale didn't want the office touched. The feather was just a signal. Means done. Means the false form is in. Means the job that comes off the press is the revised one. Pell made a choking noise behind us. Creed ignored him. Kramer said, Every feather? Marked night? Creed nodded once. Everyone. There it was. Clean, ugly, sufficient. He went on because once a man like that breaks, he often prefers function to suspense. The invitations first, then club cards, then circulars, then broadsides. Anything where two versions helped. One for donors, one for districts, one for public use, one for private reading. Bale liked alternatives. Said politics was the management of emphasis. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly. Not weariness, confirmation. And Vane? Kramer asked. Creed hesitated. Wolfe said, Mr. Vane recognized Bale's phrasing in the forged circulars and intended disclosure. Creed looked at him. Yes. Kramer's voice went flat. Who killed Keene? Creed licked his lips. I wasn't there. Bale told Pyle Keene had become greedy and frightened, said he might bring the whole structure down. Pyle arranged the meeting at the shop. After that, I was told the work would stop for a few days. Who told you? Bale's secretary first, Bale himself later. Kramer handed the plate to Purley. That will do for now. Purley took Creed's arm. Creed did not resist. Men who have spent months moving forged words around know the feel of inevitability when it finally prints. As Kramer started him toward the front, Wolfe said, Mr. Creed. Creed turned. The blue feather was imbecilic. For the first time all evening Creed almost smiled. That was Bale's joke, not mine. After they had gone, taking Purley, Creed, the case, and the room's bad oxygen with them, silence sat among the presses. Pell had sunk onto a stool again. I should have spoken. Yes, Wolfe said. That was all. With Wolfe, a single syllable can carry enough reproach to keep a man awake for years. I looked at the typecase, honest letters in shallow drawers, and behind them the apparatus for false voices. Lead is a simple substance. It doesn't care whether it prints a prayer, a ballot, a love note, or a fraud. Men supply the corruption. Metal only takes the impression. Wolfe moved from the doorway with heavy caution and visible annoyance at his own participation in physical events. Archie, the office. On the cab ride back, he said nothing. I knew better than to fill the silence. He had got what he wanted. Not the whole confession, not the final proof of the killer's hand, but the essential bridge. Creed had named Bale's orders and confirmed the system. Every blue feather marked a night when false plates had been inserted. Every feather marked job had been made to speak with two voices. By the time we reached West 35th Street, the city had gone on printing itself. Headlines, gossip, lies, weather, promises. Inside the brownstone Fritz had coffee waiting and the lamps turned low and civilized. Wolfe lowered himself into his chair with a grunt that included fatigue, victory, and outrage at upholstery. Being so far from the composing room, I took my notebook out. Well, I said, the trap worked, of course. It is touching how often you say that after the fact. He ignored it. Creed is merely a conduit, but a useful one. The principle is now established. Bale commissioned revisions through Pyle and Creed. Keene executed them. The feather signaled completion. Mr. Vane recognized the style within the forgery. Therefore, he became dangerous. Next remains only the final allocation of hands. Meaning who struck Keene? Yes. I nodded. And tomorrow evening you intend to tell them all? No, Wolfe said. I intend to tell them what they cannot survive hearing. That was Wolfe again. Not drama, taxonomy. I looked once more at the notes, at Bale's phrasing, Creed's admission, the feather bundle in the open case, and Pell's collapsed conscience. The trap had been set in lead, but it had closed on something softer and meaner, the city's habit of changing words until guilt walked away in another man's coat. Tomorrow Wolfe would put Bale in his office and make him listen while the revised text of his own life was read aloud. Chapter 10. Words Without Disguise. The final gathering in Nero Wolfe's office began at 7 o'clock and achieved discomfort by 7:10. That is quicker than average. Fritz had seen to the lights, the chairs, the coffee service waiting out of sight, and the general dignity of the room, which is considerable even when occupied by liars. The brownstone was at its evening best. The books along the walls stood in ordered ranks, the rugs glowed darkly. A coal fire, unnecessary but civilized, held a measured red in the grate. Somewhere above us the orchids were in their rooms, tended and inscrutable, receiving better treatment than most witnesses. Wolfe was installed behind his desk, enormous, composed, and as coldly receptive as a granite idol that had learned to talk. I had arranged the chairs in a crescent. It is an old Wolfe device, and a good one. Put people half facing one another, and they begin acting for the audience before they remember to guard themselves from the judge. Harold Vane came first, lean, contained, and carrying strain as if it were an overcoat he refused to remove. Della Vane followed, dressed in dark blue and looking as if she had reduced sleep to a rumor. Leonard Pell arrived with a face like wet paper. Mrs. Keene came next, composed, pale, and too careful in every movement. Jonas Pyle entered with the neat assurance of a man who had long ago made peace with the existence of dirt, provided it stayed off his own cuffs. Alderman Colin Drake lumbered in after him, smooth and pink and faintly indignant at being summoned anywhere not covered by patronage. Last came Councilman Orrin Bale, smiling. That smile told me more than anything he said for the first 10 minutes. Men who are innocent often arrive angry, frightened, or contemptuous. Men who are practiced arrive smiling because they still believe arrangement can save them. Inspector Kramer and Pearlie Stebbins were present too, of course. Kramer had the look of a man who knows the room contains one murderer and several nuisances and is reserving judgment on which class irritates him more. Pearlie took his place near the door and became furniture with muscles. When they had all sat, Wolfe surveyed them, lips compressed. "Good evening," he said. "We are here because Mr. Emil Keene was murdered in his printing shop, because false texts were introduced into that shop for political and social fraud, and because some of you believed disguise would serve where truth might prove expensive. It has not." Nobody answered. That was wise. Wolfe turned his head slightly. "Mr. Kramer, has Mr. Creed spoken further?" Kramer grunted. "Enough." That was all Wolfe needed. He folded his hands on the desk. "Then let us proceed." Mr. Keene's shop printed alternate plates for invitations, circulars, broadsides, and other private matter. These were hidden in Leonard Pell's typecase behind ordinary fonts and brought into use on selected nights. A blue feather, torn from costume trim supplied on Riddle Street, was left as a signal that substitution had been completed. Mr. Pell observed the signal without fully understanding it. Mr. Creed used it as instructed. Bale shifted one leg over the other. If this concerns Creed, then perhaps the police should confine themselves to him. Wolfe ignored him, which is one of his nastier weapons. The false invitations admitted persons under borrowed names to private entertainments arranged by Miss Della Vane. The altered circulars split Harold Vane's reform appeal by issuing contradictory texts under one authorship. The forged broadsides attacked not Mr. Vane's enemies, but his allies, thereby poisoning his own foundation. All this was done through revision, substitution, and deliberate confusion. Harold Vane leaned forward. And by whom? Wolfe's eyes moved to Bale. By the man who understood that public support may conceal private sabotage, Councilman Orrin Bale. Drake muttered, "Hell." Bale smiled a little wider. "That is absurd." "No," Wolfe said, "merely unpleasant." He picked up 2 sheets from his desk, Harold Vane's genuine circular and the altered version. Then he took a third, one of Bale's public statements. Mr. Vane recognized in the forged text not merely hostile editing, but Mr. Bale's habits of phrasing. He understood at last that the charges had been softened, redirected, and domesticated in a style peculiar to Mr. Bale. Most men reveal themselves by speech. Mr. Bale revealed himself by revision. A matter of literary criticism is not evidence of murder. Indeed not. That is why we have more. Wolfe nodded to me. I handed the inspector the packet we had prepared. Photographs of the hidden plates, samples of the missing circulars, ledger notes from Keen's shop, Lorimer's records of costume trim sales, and the statement Creed had given after his arrest in Pell's composing room with the leather case open before him. Kramer distributed what needed distributing and kept the rest. Wolfe resumed. Mr. Creed has confessed that he acted as mechanic, carrying plates, corrected text, and instructions between Mr. Bale's office, Mr. Pyle, and Mr. Keene. He placed the blue feather on every night. False plates were inserted. Those insertions are matched to the hidden plates recovered from Pell's typecase, to the duplicate invitations, to the missing circulars, and to the trail from Riddle Street's costume stock, to Pell's print room. Pyle said sharply, "Creed is a liar." Kramer turned his head. "Sit still." Wolfe's tone did not change. "Mr. Pyle, your usefulness lies chiefly in confirming other people's guilt by your company. Do not overreach." That shut him. Mrs. Keene spoke then, and her voice was low. "My husband was frightened." Everyone looked at her. Wolfe inclined his head. "Yes, he told me the work had gone too far. At first it was only alterations for money, then more names, more plates, more private deliveries. He said he wanted out. He took copies. He kept a list. He thought he could protect himself." "By blackmail?" Wolfe asked. She closed her eyes once. "By caution, then by blackmail, perhaps. I don't know when one became the other." Harold Vane said, "He sent me word he had something to show me." "That is correct," Wolfe said, because Mr. Vane had discovered forged broadsides attacking his own allies, and, more dangerously, had recognized Mr. Bale's hand in the wording. He intended to expose the scheme. Mr. Keene, meanwhile, possessed the plates, records, and knowledge to prove it. Together, they became intolerable. Bale uncrossed his legs. His hands remained calm, which interested me. He had moved beyond performance into measurement. "You still have not shown murder," he said. Wolfe leaned back. "Very well." Mr. Pyle arranged the meeting at Keen's shop. The night Keene died, he did so at Mr. Bale's direction, conveyed through Creed and Bale's secretary. Mr. Pyle expected, I think, to buy silence, or at least recover the most dangerous material. Instead there was quarrel. Keene demanded more. Threats were made. Mr. Pyle did not strike the blow. That was Mr. Bale's miscalculation. He came in person. That landed like a dropped safe. Della Vane gasped. Drake swore softly. Pyle went pale. which on him improved the lines but not the soul. Bale did not move at all, Kramer said. You got proof of that? Wolfe nodded once. Yes, not from brilliance, unfortunately, but from vanity. Mr. Bale, unlike Creed or Pyle, does not know printing shops. He entered the rear room and set his leather portfolio on the imposing stone, while Keane argued. The twin metal clasps left curved abrasions which I observed. Mr. Pell identified the case as unlike Keane's own. Yesterday, when Creed was arrested, he stated that Bale insisted on attending the final conference because Keane no longer trusted intermediaries. Moreover, the missing papers Mrs. Keane removed after the murder were passed by station locker to Eileen Grant and then to Mr. Pyle. But one item had already been copied, Harold Vane's true campaign sheets, which Mr. Keane had hidden separately. I reached into my desk drawer and lifted a wrapped packet. Harold Vane half rose. You found them. I did, I said. In the lining of the black portfolio case after Creed told us where Bale kept a reserve pocket sewn behind the inner flap. Kramer took the packet, opened it, and thumbed through. There were the original campaign sheets, true text, strong text, the ones naming ward bosses plainly and not sparing them, with practical little obediences and harmless accommodations. They had nearly disappeared forever. Harold Vane exhaled, sat back, and looked not relieved but sick. A man may survive slander and still feel dirty when the authentic version of himself is handed back by the police, Wolfe said. Thus the city may see at last how a man may be murdered first in print and only afterward in the street. Mr. Vane's public character was attacked through revision before any blow was struck at anyone's body. Mr. Keane died because he operated the machinery of that attack and then sought to profit from his knowledge of it. Bale's smile had finally gone. Creed is protecting himself. Pell is a coward. Keane's widow is compromised. This is a mound of frightened people. Yes, Wolfe said, and under that mound lies your ruin. Bale stood. Pearlie moved. Not fast, just enough. Bale looked at Wolfe. You think rhetoric can convict me? Number evidence will. Rhetoric merely arranges its introduction. Kramer rose too. Orrin Bale, you're under arrest. Bale's eyes flicked to the door, to Pearlie, to Drake, to Pyle, each in turn perhaps measuring whether any of his arrangements still retained value. They did not. That is the trouble with systems built on revision. Eventually somebody produces the first draft, he said. On what charge? Kramer's mouth bent. Let's start with conspiracy, fraud, and homicide, and argue about vocabulary later. Pearlie took Bale's arm. This time the councilman did not resist. He had the look of a man whose last useful sentence has been amended against him. When they were gone, taking Pyle as well. After one panicked protest too many, the room sagged, not with relief. With aftershock, Delavane stared at the carpet. I thought it was only arranging people invitations, introductions, a little discretion. Wolfe snorted. Discretion is often merely corruption in evening clothes. Harold Vane looked at the recovered sheets in Kramer's hand. Can they be issued? Yes, Kramer said, after copies are made. They will be, Wolfe said, and the forged versions with them. The comparison is essential. Harold nodded slowly. Then let them all be seen. Mrs. Keane stood. I should have stopped him. No, Wolfe said. You should have spoken. Stopping men is rarely within one's power. Speech often is. That was as near comfort as she was going to get from him. One by one they left. Drake went out muttering that he had always distrusted Bale's smile, which was typical and contemptible. Delavane left without looking at her brother. Mrs. Keane moved as if walking under invisible weight. Pell nearly bowed himself through the doorway with gratitude and shame mixed to a paste. At last only Kramer, Wolfe, and I remained. Kramer stood with the packet under one arm. All right, Wolfe, you got him. Wolfe made a dismissing gesture. Phooey. You got him. I merely corrected the text. Kramer grunted. One of these days that mouth of yours is going to get edited with a fist. It has waited many years in vain. Kramer gave me a look that suggested I deserved partial punishment for employment. then went out with Pearlie. Silence settled over the office. Fritz entered with coffee and a small tray of sandwiches, because in this house even the fall of a political plot does not excuse barbarism. He withdrew. I took my cup and stretched my legs. "Well," I said, "that concludes another civic improvement." Wolfe sipped temporarily. The true campaign sheets are recovered. Bale is under arrest. Creed has confessed. The hidden plates match the missing circulars. The costume stock from Riddle Street leads straight to Pell's Typecase, and the feather signals by my standards that is almost tidy. Your standards are lax. Certainly. It keeps me cheerful. He set down the cup. His face held that look of cold satisfaction he permits himself when the result has justified the disturbance. Not joy. Wolfe does not do joy in criminal matters. At best he does restoration. At least, I said. The words are back in their proper clothes. He glared. Number, that is precisely wrong. Words are dangerous enough without helping them change clothes. That was the last word on the case. And a good one. Outside, New York continued to grind and bargain and misprint itself, but for the moment one set of lies had been stripped down to its lead and ink. Harold Vane's real sheets would go to press. The forged broadsides would be exposed beside them. The city would see, if only briefly, how a reputation may be killed in type before blood ever reaches the pavement. Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. The fire made a small civilized sound. Upstairs, the orchids waited for morning. In the kitchen, Fritz was probably preparing something restorative and exact. The brownstone had resumed its proper business, sheltering order against the city's endless appetite for confusion. I looked at the empty chairs where the evening's actors had sat and lied and failed. Then I got up to see whether Fritz had included mustard with the sandwiches, because justice is all very well, but a man has to live.